Good afternoon. Welcome to York Hall and to the York County Historical Committee's lecture series. We're so glad that you're joining us. If it's your first time, welcome. We have regular lectures in the fall, and our spring lecture series will be determined soon, and so look out for information about that. If you're joining us and you've been here before, thanks for coming back. This lecture is being recorded and can be viewed at a later time, so just to be aware of that as far as noise and things like that. It should last about 1 hour with a Q&A after, and I will be able to hand the microphone to you so we get your questions recorded as well. The bathrooms are located downstairs so that you can there's an elevator or the stairs. And I now have the pleasure of introducing our featured speaker today, Jeff Acosta. So Jeff enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps in 1973. He was an infantryman who served in the Marine Detachment, USS Franklin D. Roosevelt, and as an infantry squad leader with the 2nd Marine Division at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. In 1976, Jeff left active duty, transferring to the U.S. Marine Corps and Corps Reserve. He attended Tidewater Community College, receiving his Associate of Arts in 1979. Jeff transferred to Old Dominion University, receiving his Bachelor of Arts degree in History in 1981. It was at ODU that he met his wife, Celeste Manugo, who was born in the Philippines. Celeste immigrated to the U.S. through her father, Francisco Manugo's service in the U.S. Navy. Jeff and Celeste married in 1982. They have 2 sons, Gabriel and Jeffrey, and 2 grandsons, Alexander and Christian. I'll keep going. In 1981, Jeff was commissioned a 2nd lieutenant in the U.S. Marine Corps, where he became a field artillery officer assigned to the 2nd Marine Division. Between 82 and 85, he participated in combat operations on Grenada and in Beirut, Lebanon. In 1985, Jeff transferred back to the U.S. Marine Corps Reserve and returned to ODU. He received his Master of Arts in History with a thesis in 1992. Between 1985 and 98, he was the museum curator at the MacArthur Memorial in Norfolk, Virginia, and was a member of the Filipino American National Historical Society Hampton Roads chapter. As an officer in the Marine Corps Reserve, he served as a field artillery and infantry officer in various units of the 4th Marine Division, was assigned to the U.S. Marine Corps History Division as a field historian, and served as the staff secretary to the commander, U.S. Marine Corps Forces Atlantic. In 2001, Jeff was hired by General Dynamics Corporation as a defense contractor. After the attacks on 11th of September 2001, he was recalled to active duty, serving 2 tours of duty in Iraq as a field historian and later as a civil affairs officer. He became an adjunct instructor in U.S. and world history at Tidewater Community College in 2009. Jeff retired from the United States Marine Corps in December 2011 with the rank of colonel. During his 38 years of service in the U.S. Marine Corps, he was a recipient of the Meritorious Service Medal, Gold Star in lieu of 2nd Award, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal, Combat Action Ribbon, Gold Star in lieu of 2nd Award, and the Marine Corps Good Conduct Medal. In 2022, Jeff was elected to the National Board of Trustees of Filipino American National Historical Society. He was a recipient of the Tidewater Community College 2022 Outstanding Adjunct Faculty Award and the Virginia Community College System 2024 George B. Vaughn Leadership Award for Outstanding Adjunct Faculty. We are so happy to have you, and now let's welcome Jeff to the...
Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Waiting for some people get through the tunnel in Hampton Roads, so I will speak slowly. No, we're going to move ahead. Okay, so basically, first thing I want to do is give you an idea of how important the Filipino American community is to Virginia. If you look, the population of Virginia based on the 2020 census is about 8.7 million. And the Filipino American population is about almost 81,000, about almost 1% of the population of Virginia. If you look at Filipino Americans who are in combination, as the U.S. Census Bureau calls it, we call them mestizo. In other words, Filipinos who have married somebody of another ethnic group, you can see that number jumps to 122,000, about 1.4%. And as a result, when you look at macro, the big view, Virginia ranks 10th in the United States in terms of the Philippine American population. 80,816 is about full-blooded Filipinos, and then on the right-hand column, 122,000 is those who can claim a Filipino ancestor. Somebody who can claim a Filipino ancestor, and they put it on the Census Bureau. Now, if you look at that numbered #2, that makes us second in terms of the Asian American community in Virginia. Anybody know who's number one? Chinese? No. India, South Asian, India. They are number one now in Virginia. And when we look at Hampton Roads, when we talk about Hampton Roads, no offense to Yorktown, but I don't know where you fall in sometimes, but we're looking at the peninsula, we're looking primarily at Hampton and Newport News. South side, we're looking at Virginia Beach, Norfolk, Chesapeake, Portsmouth, and Suffolk. Those are what we consider Hampton Roads. Now, this is an idea of how everything breaks down for the Philippine American community in the 2020 census based on the 7 cities, and it's only natural that Virginia Beach has the largest Philippine American community of the 7 cities. The smallest, as you all can see, is Portsmouth and Suffolk. They're the 2 smallest. Now, big ideas. What makes the Philippine American community unique is that they have used the military service in the U.S. Armed Forces as a way to gain citizenship. Now, this is a very long story. It is not easy. In addition, we know that Filipino Americans, we think, started serving in the armed forces as early as the War of 1812. As a matter of fact, one of the oldest Philippine American communities in the United States was Filipino sailors who jumped ship in New Orleans and went to live into the Louisiana Delta. And some of them may have joined up with Lafitte's pirates, who joined Andrew Jackson in the defense of New Orleans in the War of 1812. But we've got to still document that. Now, what we're going to cover here is all the branches except the Space Force, because they are the newest. And some would consider them not a real branch of the armed forces anyway. That's the Marine Corps' version, okay? We have very high standards. Now, so the first documented Filipino American for our community is the Civil War. Now, we know that Filipinos served in both the Confederate forces and the United States forces, both for the Union and the Confederacy. More than likely, those that served in the Confederacy were from families in the Louisiana area. A lot of those who served in the United States Army and Navy were Filipino sailors who had migrated to the U.S. by service in the U.S. Merchant Marine. So why did they pick sides? The same reason most Americans during the Civil War picked sides. It was a much different country then. Most Americans lived and died within 60 miles of the place most Americans died within 60 miles of the place they were born. There wasn't a lot of travel. So if their neighbors went to war, if you're from Louisiana, you're going to support the Confederacy. If you're from Virginia, you're going to support the Confederacy. If you're from Michigan or New York, you're going to support the Union. Now, one of the first to fight for the United States Army that is documented, very much so by the Philippine American Historical Society Michigan chapter, working with Civil War veterans, was Felix Balderi. He fought for the 11th Michigan Volunteers, and unlike African Americans, Filipino Americans serving in the Civil War did not have to fight in racially segregated units. They were just part of their county units, which are traditional what you saw during the Civil War. Now we know that there were at least 6 Filipino sailors on a Confederate warship, the CSS Gaines. Now the Gaines was destroyed in combat against the US Navy during the Battle of Mobile Bay on the 5th of August, 1864. And the fate of the 6 Filipino-American crewmen, we don't know what happened to them after the war. We don't know where they went. Now, thanks to Filipino historians like a retired Navy chief, Nestor Enriquez in New Jersey, part of Fonz, New Jersey, Virgilio R. Pilapil, and Florio Mercen, we now know a lot more about Filipinos in the Civil War because these 3 gentlemen literally went to the National Archives and just started going through records. And the records for almost all Philippine veterans are located at the National Archives in downtown Washington. But as you know, we think there were over 1 million veterans of the Civil War, both Union and Confederate. So they have done the research, and they've been able to identify, at least we know for sure, 64 or more. And it's hard work. Now, thanks to their work, we located one of those veterans, John Bacor. And Bacor had joined the United States Navy out of New York. We're not sure how he came to the U.S., probably through service in the Merchant Marine. He was a merchant sailor. He served aboard the USS Santiago to Cuba. However, about a month before the Civil War ended in Virginia, about a month before Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, he came down with respiratory disease. And he was transferred to his ship to the Portsmouth Naval Hospital. And while at the Portsmouth Naval Hospital, he succumbed to pneumonia about 2 weeks before the Civil War ended in Virginia. And he's buried there. And we did not know that. And it was thanks to the research of Nestor Enriquez and Virgilio Pilapel and Florio L. Mercen that we were able to triangulate and realize that this Filipino was buried in Portsmouth. Well, many of us didn't even know Portsmouth Naval Hospital had a cemetery on the property grounds, the Naval Hospital grounds. You just can't see it from the water because it's blocked off by all the buildings. And there's about 880 graves there, most of them Civil War veterans who died during the Civil War that were sick. And so he's our first documented Filipino-American in the Hampton Roads area who served in the Civil War. Now, probably one of the worst periods, let's understand something. The Philippines is a creation of Europeans. A bunch of Europeans got together in the 15th century, primarily Spain and Portugal, working through the Pope, to divide up what today we call East Asia, splitting the Philippine archipelago off from the Indonesian archipelago. As a result, the Philippines becomes a colony of Spain. As a matter of fact, one Filipino historian describes Filipino history prior to 1946 as 400 years of the monastery and 50 years of Hollywood. The Philippine-American War was something that was not on William McKinley's radar screen. Matter of fact, the only guy that knew where the Philippines was, who was a member of his administration, was some young assistant secretary of the Navy who would go nowhere in his political career by the name of Theodore Roosevelt. And Roosevelt in the Navy had already begun making war plans as the United States was expanding. Now, unlike the Europeans, when we start colonial expansion, it's not because we need resources. The U.S. had all the resources it needed. We needed a marketplace. We needed some place to sell the excess goods being produced by United States industry during the Industrial Revolution. And the ideal spot was China. But we didn't want to get stuck on the mainland, the Chinese mainland, the way the British, the French, the Germans, the Russians, and the Japanese were. We wanted to be offshore, and that's how the Navy was looking at the Philippine archipelago. That's what they wanted. It would give us an offshore base. Plus, whoever controls the South China Sea controls all the trade with China. And you can control the South China Sea very effectively from Manila Bay. You can control it. Now, this war was very bloody. It was very ugly. Our policy was called benevolent assimilation. William McKinley, among the many reasons he gives for conquering the Philippines after the Treaty of Paris, and let me back that up a little bit. The war in Cuba of the Spanish-American War was 90 days of combat and was over within 90 days. That still left the Philippines. When McKinley receives the telegram from Admiral Dewey that he had destroyed the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay and wanted further orders, McKinley's reaction, according to most observers, was WTF. What's in the Philippines? I'm not going to go into that because this is public and going out. My students would know what that means. But it's, it was, why are we in the Philippines? Well, what that Assistant Secretary of the Navy forgot to tell the President on his way to join the Rough Riders in Cuba was he had ordered in December 1897 the new commander of the American squadron, Pacific Squadron, which was a grand total of 8 ships, by the way, George Dewey, that if war came between the United States and Spain, he was to go to the Philippines and destroy the Spanish squadron. So as a result, President McKinley himself, how much we knew is still unclear, but what is clear is he definitely did not have any policy concerning the Philippines. If you look at the declaration of war between the United States and Spain, there was the famous Teller Amendment, in which policy was that once the United States won the war, Cuba would become an independent nation. But nowhere in that declaration of war is you're going to see any mention of Guam, the Philippines, or Puerto Rico, which the U.S. also took over as a result of this conflict. So much of the summer of 1898 in Paris, France, you had these negotiations on how to end the war. Now, by now, Emilio Aguinaldo had reestablished himself back in the Philippines and established what will become known as the First Philippine Republic. His thought, and he swore to the day he died, he had been promised by American interlocutors and diplomats that once the war ended, Spain, the Philippines would be granted its sovereignty. There's no record of that. So now you got who's lying, who's telling the truth here. And the Filipinos are going to side with Aguinaldo. The U.S. government sided with the American representatives. So as a result, there's a lot of confusion. Even the Spaniards didn't know what they wanted to do with the Philippines. As late as August 1898, they're thinking, okay, we give the United States the biggest island. By the way, anybody know how many islands are in the Philippine archipelago? Just take a guess. 7,000. Yes, of which with climate change, we're probably going to lose a couple of hundred, okay? And there's this big debate going on in Washington about what do we do, even in Madrid. And if things don't even get any fuzzier, 7 days after, May 1st, 1898, Dewey wins the famous Battle of Manila Bay. Trust me, it was a cakewalk for the U.S. Navy. But 7 days later, without warning, the German Navy sails into Manila Bay. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the oldest grandson of Queen Victoria of Great Britain, had decided he wanted the Philippines. And he wanted to show force, and he was already contacting the Spanish government, words to the effect, don't give it to these Americans, give it to Germany. And there was almost a fight broke out between Dewey's squadron and the German squadron. And then other nations begin to show up. The British, the Royal Navy shows up. The Imperial Japanese Navy shows up. And sadly, when you look at it, what was going to happen, and I think some Filipinos on the shore were aware of this, was that the future of the Philippines was not independence, but further colonization. Now, the Filipinos did send diplomats to Washington. McKinley listened to them, we don't know how much, and then sent them on their way. These diplomats of the First Philippine Republics then went to Paris. where they were not permitted to participate in the peace talks. They were cut out. Okay, so this decision that was going to be made that results in the Treaty of Paris of 1898 is going to be strictly a real estate deal between the United States and the Spanish government. Now, McKinley finally announces U.S. policy towards the Philippines around early December 1898. He calls it benevolent assimilation. This splits the country, the United States in particular. You have the anti-imperialist, which was a really interesting group. It included wonderful social activists like the writer Mark Twain and Jane Addams. It included most of the African American press at that time. Remember, we had a segregated media, racially segregated. And the African American press attitude towards this was, why are we going to export American racism to the Philippines? Remember, this is the height of racial segregation in the United States. However, the KKK and other white nationalist groups say, yeah, we don't want the Philippines. We don't want more brown people in the United States. Andrew Carnegie offers, we paid $20 million for the Philippines. Andrew Carnegie writes a letter to McKinley and says, I'll tell you what, dude, I'm the richest man in America. I'll give you $20 million, just let it go. Just let it go. Leave them to their fate. Whoever colonizes them, fine, but we don't want any part of it. So you can see this was a very divisive war. And fighting began around the time the Senate, by one vote. For those of you, your political science lesson, a treaty to be ratified in the U.S. Senate, you need a supermajority, 2/3. McKinley only made it by one vote. And now the Philippines was a territory of the United States, as far as the rest of the world was concerned. Now, for a long time in the history books, we called it the Philippine Insurrection. Like the Filipinos were supposed to follow U.S. law, you know? They didn't have a right to sovereignty. But either way, this was a bloody war that doesn't end until, depending on who the historian is, sometime between 1902 and 1910, mainly because of fighting with the Moros down in Mindanao, which, oh, by the way, made that interesting. Not only do you have 7,100 islands, they speak 8 languages and 80 dialects in the Philippines, and 15% of the population are Muslim. They're Muslim, who don't get along well with the Filipino Catholics at this time. So it's complicated. The Americans go in, they have no idea what they've stepped into. At first, the Aguinaldo, the president of the Philippine Republic, attempts to fight a conventional war against the Americans, and that does not go well. His officers are young, inexperienced. Very young and inexperienced, and they're going against an American army led by Civil War veterans, campaigned against the first Americans out west. These are experienced, seasoned officers. In addition, you have the industrial power of the United States and then the United States Navy, which puts a maritime blockade around the Philippines that is watertight. I have a more colorful euphemism, but I can't use it. But the bottom line is, unlike what you see during the American Revolution, where the blockade that the Royal Navy places around the 13 colonies is porous. The French are able to get through it. Not in this case. The U.S. Navy prevents the Filipinos not only from bringing in any weapons from the outside, but also even doing inter-island communication. And what makes it worse, not another nation on earth would come to the defense of the Filipinos. All the great imperial powers had said, this is it, it's U.S. territory, we're moving on. We're going to focus on China, the Boxer Rebellion. That was going to be their focus of main effort. Now, the Americans quickly, they needed help. And by the way, Aguinaldo doesn't have the support of a lot of Filipinos. Among them are the Macabebe, who don't like the Tagalogs. So the U.S. takes a page out of their campaigns against the first Americans, just like when Custer traveled, he had Crow scouts with him. Why? Because the Crow hated the Sioux and the Arapaho. The Macabebes don't like the Tagalogs, and they don't like Aguinaldo. So now we have Filipinos joining the fight. On top of that, Because of the problems of manpower for the Navy and ships, the Navy raises all those Spanish warships we sunk, but we have to have crews to put them in commission. So on the 8th of April, 1901, Secretary of the Navy John Long authorized the enlistment of 500 Filipino sailors into the U.S. Navy. They would serve on the Insular Force. So now you already have Filipinos serving in the U.S. Army as scouts, and you have them also in the U.S. Navy. Now, eventually, the Macabebes are going to help Frederick Funston capture Aguinaldo in what many consider one of the earliest examples of a special operations mission conducted by the United States. The bottom line is the combination of Macabebes pretending to have, basically what happened is this. By the time you got to 1901, the U.S. had a pretty good intelligence network on Luzon, and they intercepted a message by a messenger. The problem for Aguinaldo, he had to use messengers. He couldn't, radios didn't exist. There's no internet. So he's got to use messengers, and one of his guys got captured, which gave away an approximate location up in the mountains of northeast Luzon, where Aguinaldo was. Now, an American soldier couldn't get anywhere near the place. He would be spotted right away, the warning would go, Aguinaldo moves. So now the idea, Funston says, we're going to have 7 us pretend to be captured, 7 officers. And the Macabebes are going to dress as First Philippine Republic soldiers, and we're going to try to get access. And they very quietly get on a Navy ship, the USS Yorktown. They're dropped off the northeast coast of Luzon. They come ashore, and it works. They got access to Aguinaldo's camp, and Aguinaldo comes out to greet him. The Macabebes shoot his security, and he's quickly captured. He's taken back to the Yorktown. He's brought back to Manila, where Arthur MacArthur, whose son is buried right across the river, does something unusual. Instead of putting him in prison, he puts him in a gilded cage, which is a polite way house arrest at Malacañang Palace, which is the current White House of the Philippines. And he keeps him there until eventually he agrees to end the conflict. He signs a document saying the war is over. And he doesn't surrender. MacArthur is very careful not to use what MacArthur felt would be insulting language. Telling him to surrender, he's just going to dig in. But if we ask him to cease resistance, and we have very liberal terms for all these Filipino soldiers to just cease resistance, come in, turn in your weapons, go home. That's it. Aguinaldo agrees, and that's what happens. Now, what's ironic is within 10 years, if you look at the U.S. government decides to set up a Philippine legislature. We're going to follow the British Raj system. And what we're going to have is you'll have an American Governor General of the Philippines, but the actual organization that will do day-to-day running of the Philippines for the U.S. are Filipinos. But it's going to be an elected unicameral legislature. Well, most of the people that are elected to this legislature are veterans of Aguinaldo's army. So his people are in essence running the Philippines for the U.S., and that's what's going to happen. Now, this is just a list of acts that occur that you see the United States is trying to figure out what to do with the Philippines. We realize it's impossible to defend the archipelago. You have a rising imperial power in Japan. That when World War I comes, the head of the Philippine legislature, Manuel Quezon, says, hey, I want to send Filipinos to fight in France alongside the Allies, the associated power. The U.S. says, no, what we would like you to do is just garrison the island for us. Keep the peace at home. So by then, you're going to see up to 16,000 Filipinos in the U.S. Army, mainly as Philippine scouts. However, Filipino sailors serving in the Navy are going to serve all over the world with the Navy. Let me try this again. Now, in between those war years in 1912, one of those Filipinos serving aboard the cruiser San Diego as a fireman down in the engine room, what's going to happen, there'll be a boiler explosion. The engine room catches fire off Mexico, the west coast of Mexico. And what he does is, though badly burned himself, he re-enters the engine room. Telesforo Trinidad re-enters the engine room to save 2 of his shipmates. And for that, he was awarded, became a recipient of the Medal of Honor. Understand, prior to 1945, the Navy did have a peacetime, the Medal of Honor could be given not just for combat action. And this is before 1943-45 is when the Navy made it purely combat. A sailor could receive the Medal of Honor if there was something happening aboard ship and they showed conduct above and beyond the call of duty. For example, you have several where sailors jumped overboard in the middle of storms to save shipmates who were blown overboard. He got one for rescuing his shipmates. And what's been announced is that on the 22nd of May, 2024, well, let me back up. Actually, 2022, it was announced that we are going to build a destroyer, an Arleigh-Burke destroyer, in honor of Telesforo Trinidad. They've authorized the building. They haven't begun construction yet. And if there is construction, it's probably going to be up at Bath Iron Works in Maine. Now, where's the ship going to be once it's built? I have no idea. Another experiment was this ship, the Rizal, which was paid for by Filipinos as part of the war bond effort during World War I to support the American war effort. The United States Navy tried an experiment to have an all-Filipino crew to reduce the number of American sailors who had to be rotated to the Philippines on duty. So from about 1919 to 1931, this ship, the USS Rizal, named after the Philippine national hero Jose Rizal, had an all-Filipino crew with the exception of the senior petty officers and the officers. Those were Americans. But it did operate in the Philippine waters. Now, it was decommissioned eventually because we had to reduce the number of warships in the US Navy as part of the Washington Naval Treaty. We had to reduce the ships. Now, what is going to be a problem for Filipino Americans will be the Tidings-McDuffie Act. This act of Congress, signed in 1934 and signed into law by Franklin Roosevelt with the assistance of Manuel Quezon, who you see standing directly behind President Roosevelt. So the Filipino legislature was on board with this, was going to set the Philippines on a path to independence or sovereignty. Starting in 1936, the Philippines would become a commonwealth of the United States, and independence would be granted in 1946. In the 10 years in between, however, the United States would help the Philippines build all the government infrastructure that a nation needed. That included an armed forces. So the armed forces had to be built. Now, not all Filipinos are happy because part of the problem with the Tidings-McDuffie Act is now Filipinos are no longer U.S. nationals. They are going to be treated like any other group of immigrants. And they were restricted to 50 Filipinos, 50 in a year, 50 Filipinos would be allowed to immigrate to the U.S. As a matter of fact, the U.S. was paying Filipinos on the West Coast money to go back to the Philippines. Filipinos complained to Manuel Quezon. His attitude was, you want to be an American, then you deal with American racism. Otherwise, come home. We need you. Otherwise, I'm not complaining to the Americans. We need your talent. You want to stay? Stay. Good luck. You deal with all the problems. Now, for Filipino sailors, this was a problem. The Navy didn't know what to do. And so the Navy did one thing that really hurt the economy, the local economy around Subic Bay in particular, was they stopped recruiting Filipinos in the U.S. Navy for a brief period in the 1930s. Other Filipinos, such as Roberto Neri, who is one of our oldest, the patriarch of one of the oldest Filipino-American families in Virginia Beach, Norfolk and Virginia Beach, he was stationed here. he had to sign what was called the Declaration of Intention, that if given an opportunity, like a green card, he would try to become a U.S. citizen, but that was blocked. But the Navy did not force any Filipinos to leave the Navy. They could stay as long as they wanted because they were outstanding sailors. Now, back in the Philippines, the United States is trying to figure out how to get ready for a coming war with Japan. That's a whole separate history course. But if you note that by the time you get to the mid-1930s, you have in the U.S. Army the Philippine Division. It's one regiment of regular U.S. Army soldiers and 2 regiments of Philippine Scouts, and most of the artillery was run by Philippine Scouts. Best soldiers in the Army at the time, among the best. If you were a white officer assigned to the Philippine Scouts, that was considered good duty. That was good duty. You wanted it. Okay? And this was generational. You had several generations by this time, at least 2 generations of families in the Philippines who had served in the Scouts. Now, when MacArthur arrives, his job is to build an independent Philippine armed forces, separate from the Scouts. And that's what people get confused. The Scouts belong to the United States. Now you got to build an army made up of Filipinos. And he's got to start from scratch. And it's hard, especially when you have a country where they speak 7 languages and 80 dialects. And part of the problem is within the Philippines is Tagalogs, Ilocanos held most political power. They're the officers, but they can't communicate with enlisted people from the Bicol region because they don't speak Bicol. Or from Cebu, they don't speak Cebuana. This is a problem trying to build a Philippine army, and one of MacArthur's advisors, who you see in the picture standing center with the Philippine aviators, is another guy who goes nowhere, Dwight D. Eisenhower, some major, doesn't have much of a military career, who's helping MacArthur put this together. Now, some argue this is where Ike learned how to put together an Allied army, because now he's got to unite Filipinos. He's got to get them past those language barriers, those regional differences. Same thing he's going to do in 1943 when he arrives in England. He's got to put together this Allied army. Great Britain, the United States, France, Poland, Canada. Go down the list. Now, Japan had the Philippines in its sight because why? Well, it gets down to, and this is, hang on, it gets down to the Pacific. Whoever controls the South China Sea controls China. And the problem for Japan is the oil reserves of that part of the world were located in Indonesia. And Japan needed fuel, it needed oil, it needed petroleum. And the problem is, as long as the U.S. controlled the Philippines, that American naval force at Subic, those American air forces flying out of Clark Field, are like a dagger to their supply lines. So something had to be done about the Philippines. Now, MacArthur is trying to build a Philippine army. Eventually, in July 1941, Franklin Roosevelt, because the Japanese moved in and took over French Indochina, what today is Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, decides that under a codicil of the Tidings-McDuffie Act, in a time of war, the Philippine Commonwealth Armed Forces are integrated and become part of the United States Armed Forces, in particular the Army. This mainly focused on the Army. And so he also brings to active duty Douglas MacArthur, the one guy who had the hope that most Filipinos depended on. MacArthur had a very good relationship with the Filipinos, especially the leadership. I talked to Mrs. MacArthur back 30 years ago, 35 years ago, Jean. I asked her, you know, what was going to happen if there wasn't World War II. The general and her planned to retire. They were going to retire in the Philippines. They would not come back to the U.S. And as further symbolism to the Filipinos, MacArthur had one son, Arthur. And he names Manuel and Aurora Quezon as the child's godparents. Now, this means a lot to Filipinos. Now they're saying, okay, Douglas MacArthur has made a decision by doing this very symbolic act. He has now tied the future of his family to the Quezon family to the Philippines. And that's why he was the best choice at the time. Now, nobody was expecting what was going to happen on December 7th, 1941 at Pearl Harbor. But he begins mobilizing the Filipino troops in July 1941. Now, the hope of MacArthur, and hope is not a plan of action, was if he could get to March, April 1942, the Philippine Army would be pretty well trained, fully mobilized, plus the United States was sending a lot of B-17 bombers to the Philippines. Plus, we were probably going to send some more U.S. troops to help bolster the defense of the island. So the problem is the Japanese had their plans, and as we know, on December 7th, 1941, December 8th, 1941, in the Philippines, they attack. Now, in '39 for the Navy, this was good news because the Navy ended its suspension of enlisting Filipinos. So what you're going to have, before December 7th, 1941, there were approximately 1,713 Filipinos serving in the Navy. Now, after the United States declared war against Japan, the Coast Guard becomes part of the Department of the Navy. For those of you who don't understand U.S. law, yes, if there is a declaration of war, the Coast Guard is no longer today, they're part of the Department of Homeland Security. No, they become the third branch of the United States Navy. And you end up, by the time you get to World War II, there's 5,500 Filipinos on active duty during the war. Now, some are recruited out of the U.S., some are recruited, they manage to escape, they get out of the Philippines and they join the Navy. A lot of them are already on Navy ships stationed around the world when the war begins. So that's why you have so many that are outside the U.S. able to join the U.S. Navy. In addition, Filipinos, when the war does begin, Filipinos do not have to serve in racially segregated units. Filipinos can join any branch of the armed forces they want. They are not forced to go into the 1st and 2nd Philippine Infantry Regiments, which were being raised for combat duty in the Philippines. Now, all right, hopefully this will work. Ah, good. See this? Right there. This is the oil supply for Japan. This is the South China Sea, Japan, and right here, the Philippines. So you can see why Japan had to take control of the Philippines. They had no choice. That would be a direct threat. U.S. forces operating out of the archipelago. Now, I'm not going to go into Bataan and Corregidor. It turns out to be a disaster. MacArthur, he does not fight a good battle, to be very honest. Eventually, U.S. forces, Filipino forces, over 122,000 men. The majority of his men are Filipinos. They retreat to the Bataan Peninsula where they hold out until April 1942. He leaves Manila. MacArthur declares Manila an open city because he doesn't want house-to-house fighting. He doesn't want the city destroyed. He fully realizes that if you go house to house, the civilians suffer, not the soldiers. So he declared it an open city, even though the Japanese kept bombing it. Now, eventually, he pulls back into Bataan, and this is also the time that you have your first Filipino war heroes. Among the first is Jesus Antonio Villamor. Now, he flies for the Philippine Army Air Corps. He is a Filipino, but he's trained in the U.S., and you see that little blue, very nice-looking airplane right here? That's about the size of my Mini Cooper. No, just joking. It's a little bigger. But this was the frontline aircraft of the Philippine Army Air Corps. Trust me, a Japanese Zero can fly circles around this thing. But flying this type of aircraft, Villamor, who was trained by a variety of Americans and was a pretty good pilot, takes that little P-26. By the way, it's nicknamed the Pea Shooter. Not hit that personal one, but these aircraft are called Pea Shooters. And he shoots down during the early days of the fighting, in the first 3 weeks of December 1941, he is credited with 3 kills over the Japanese Air Force, which is quite extraordinary considering what he was flying. And as a result, MacArthur, before Manila is evacuated, has a public ceremony where he passes out awards, and he wants to make sure the Filipino people understand this is their war too, and he awards Jesus Villamor the Distinguished Service Cross, which is number 2 behind the Medal of Honor. And he is the first Filipino to be a recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross in World War II. Now, eventually, he will, like many aviators, he will escape to Australia. In Australia, he will become part of MacArthur's intelligence sections. He will be much involved in the Allied Intelligence Bureau, which was running Philippine guerrilla operations. He will return to the Philippines to gather intelligence and to organize guerrillas. Eventually, when the war ends, he will stay in the Philippines and become part of the Philippine Armed Forces. He will also be the recipient of the Medal of Valor, which is the Filipino equivalent of the Medal of Honor for his service during World War II. Now, we all know that Bataan is going to fall, and probably one of the worst things that's going to occur is the Bataan Death March. I've talked to many Americans who were veterans of the Death March, and they pointed out not a lot of Americans died on the Death March. It was mainly Filipinos that the Japanese murdered. Now, there have been a lot. Why were the Japanese so upset with the Filipinos? One school of thought goes, their theory was that they couldn't understand why the Filipinos didn't understand. Japan was fighting for Asia for the Asiatics. Get rid of all these white colonizers. Why are you supporting these Americans? You should be embracing Japan, Imperial Japan. Well, what they forgot was the Filipino attitude. Wait a minute, we had a deal for sovereignty in 1946. Now maybe the French were going to keep the Vietnamese forever. Maybe the British were going to keep the Burmese forever, but we had a deal. We were going to be an independent nation in 1946. And oh, by the way, slapping us around on our women is no way to make friends and encourage people. Okay? So as a result, it was very bloody. This war is going to be very bloody for the Philippines. They are going to be caught between the literal rock and the hard place between the United States and Japan. Now, one good thing that comes out of this, though, is Congress revised the Nationality Act of 1940, allowing any resident alien living in the United States, including native-born Filipinos who served honorably in the armed forces for a period of 3 years, to automatically can apply for and become U.S. citizens. And let me tell you something. Filipinos in all branches of the armed forces are going to jump on this like white on rice, like stink on a skunk. As a matter of fact, the picture below is a swearing-in ceremony for the 1st Philippine Infantry Regiment. And I don't even know how many Filipinos are in that picture. But they're all being sworn in as U.S. citizens. Now, one of those that decides to go his own way is a Hawaiian, a Filipino-American living in Hawaii, Stanley Sabihon. And he joins the U.S. Army Air Force. And they send him to Europe, where he is the only known Filipino-American to be a B-17 bomber commander. He had his own B-17, the Aloha May. He flew 51 missions out of Italy with the 15th Air Force. He would, after the war, go on. This is him and his crew with their B-17G, Aloha May behind him. He would go on to try to find a Hawaiian Airlines at the end of World War II. It's an unsuccessful venture, but he lives and becomes a prominent member of the Philippine community in Hawaii after World War II. The Coast Guard. As the Coast Guard begins enlisting Filipinos when the Navy does in 1899, I apologize. 1901, let me back up. 1901, and one of the earliest is this Stewart's First Class Modesto Magbanoa. Please forgive my pronunciation. And he is going to be one of many Filipino stewards that are in the Coast Guard. As a matter of fact, when I did this presentation the first time, I had a bunch of our uncles come up to me who were in the Coast Guard and saying, yo, what about us? You know, you talk about these Navy guys. There were a bunch of us too, okay? And they were often restricted to the steward's branch. Now, one thing different than the Navy the Coast Guard did, though, it allowed Filipinos to become commissioned officers, where for some reason the Navy did not. Racism. Not the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard wasn't hung up about, you know, what's your ethnicity or what's your color. The Coast Guard wanted good sailors, and Filipinos are good sailors. As a result, 2 Filipinos will rise to command Coast Guard ships during World War II. Carmelo Manzano and Benjamin Ayese. Benjamin Ayese's ship is LST 202, which is unloading Marines at Cape Gloucester, Christmas 1943. Only Marines would want to go into combat on Christmas Eve. We get such good deals, and we were working for the Army at the time. Lucky us. Manzano is going to command what we call a supply ship, an AK, part of the Naval Transportation Service, which traveled all over the Pacific during World War II. Unfortunately, we don't have much on Isaiah. That would be good. I'm going to have to contact my contacts to go to Washington and check the records. Actually, we're probably going to have to go to St. Louis. That's where the military records for World War II veterans are located. Oops. Now, probably one of the most famous is the indomitable Florence Finch. Her dad was an American soldier who fought in the Philippines during the Philippine-American War. Her mother was Filipino. She goes to a private girls' high school in Manila. She gets a job with U.S. Army Intelligence as a stenographer. She falls in love with a sailor in the office across the hall from the Office of Naval Intelligence, Bing Smith. They get married just before the war. He's killed in action on Bataan. She starts operating with the guerrillas in Manila. Eventually, she's captured by the Japanese secret police and almost dies before she is rescued by the 1st Cavalry Division during the liberation of Manila in 1945, February 1945. However, before the war, she had communicated with her sister-in-law in Buffalo, New York, and she had nowhere to go. So she takes her husband's family's offer to come to Buffalo. Now, I wonder if she knew what type of weather she was in for. Why Buffalo, New York? But anyway, she wants to get back into the war. This woman's phenomenal. And so she enlists in the Coast Guard. Now, the Coast Guard Reserve women were called spars. And by this time, you're getting close to the end of the war. She is awarded, because of her service, the Coast Guard has to give her the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal, which she's the only woman in the Coast Guard during World War II to get the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal for combat. She's also a recipient of the United States Medal of Freedom for her conduct during World War II. And eventually, just last month, as a matter of fact, a fast response cutter was named for her. And that ship is currently stationed in Oregon. It's home-based out of Oregon. 1st and 2nd Philippine Infantry Regiments were mainly raised to go fight back in the Philippines, but a lot of these soldiers volunteer for duty to return and be sent back into the Philippines to help train Filipino guerrilla groups. Now, as you can see, they were trained in airborne operations, but those were not feasible. The primary method of infiltrating these Filipinos into the Philippines, these teams, was via submarine. The Navy dedicated 2 submarines, the Narwhal and the Nautilus, to smuggling them into the Philippines prior to the liberation of the islands. And then these are the Filipino guerrillas. And they rallied to MacArthur's call, and thanks to the intelligence they gathered, a Japanese soldier couldn't sneeze and wipe his nose without MacArthur knowing about it anywhere in the archipelago. That's how good the guerrillas were. Now, what was an injustice was when the war ended, the Philippine Rehabilitation Act denied members of the United States Army Forces Far East, these are members of the Philippine Commonwealth Armed Forces, from getting veterans benefits at the end of World War II. The GI Bill. That's what we're talking about here. They were denied the GI Bill. Now, the Philippine Scouts, because they were part of the regular Army, Filipinos serving in the Navy and the Coast Guard, or the Army Air Forces, they got the GI Bill. It was just the USAFE veterans who didn't go. And this took a long fight, and unfortunately, it's not one of the prouder moments of the US government in denying these Filipino veterans simply because of which branch they fought in. They were all fighting for the US flag. They all took an oath of allegiance to the US. They should have gotten the GI Bill. Should have been automatic. But they were singled out, and it took a long time for them to get their records. Now, it's not that Filipinos didn't, like Filipinos do, they always are going to succeed. So one of the big helps to Filipinos in the armed forces was Executive Order 9981, signed on the 26th of July, 1948, that ended racial segregation in the armed forces, which allowed Filipinos now to compete for almost all jobs in the armed forces. Now, the Navy's prejudices died hard. They still kept putting them into the Stewart's branch, but my father explained to me one reason was when you start getting into the Cold War, many of the rates in the Navy required a security clearance. And under US law, only US nationals can get a security clearance. So what you start seeing after the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, Filipinos who become US citizens can leave the Stewart's branch for other jobs in the US Navy. And a lot of them are going to send their kids to the Naval Academy or West Point or Annapolis, right? And there's also the Philippine Enlistment Program, which begins in 1947 for the Coast Guard and the Navy, which this program is the only one that ever existed in US history where foreign nationals were allowed to enlist in the Navy or the Coast Guard. Now, usually what would happen, once this kicked in 1952 and they got it organized, you would have hundreds, close to 1,000 applicants show up at Sangley Point to take the exams. They had to show proficiency in English, there were intelligence exams, and then there was the physical. And they were lucky if maybe out of 1,000, 2,000, they took 100, if they were lucky. And from there, if they made it, like my father-in-law did, you ended up going to San Diego. They were sent to San Diego for boot camp. I forgot where the Coast Guard sent theirs to. Then they went to school to learn to be steward's mates, and then they were assigned to ships. Now, when my father-in-law did this, he did not see his wife and 2 daughters for 3 years. He was gone for 3 years. Oh, by the way, he shouldn't have done it because they had to be bachelors. They could not be married. Now, eventually, my father-in-law, being a man of pride and honor, confessed. He was up for re-enlistment in the Navy. He figured they were going to find out. And the Navy, I read the board. They put him before a board of naval officers. And it's interesting, their attitude, I'm going to sum it up like this. My father confessed. This officer said, not kidding, words to the effect, all right, we got Frank here. He's a great officer. He's one of the best stewards we got on our ship. We don't know what type of dirtbag they're going to send us to replace Frank, so we got to keep Frank. We got to keep him. To which the board of officers went, Nomine Pater, Spiritus Sancte, Frank, go forth and sin no more. Welcome back, you're in the US Navy. And luckily, I got my wife and my sister-in-law out of this deal. I don't talk about the rest of the siblings. No, they're all great. But as you can see, they were rising in the ranks to include the flag rank in the Navy. Here's one of the things, okay, so all you feminists stand up and applaud in a second, okay? Last time I checked, there were 7 Filipino Americans that had flag rank, admiral rank in the Navy. 6 of them are women, okay? I'm not going to go into much. There's been the fight for everything from getting Filipino Americans in the armed forces a streamlined process for citizenship for they and their families, to President Obama in 2009 ensuring that any Filipino veterans from USAFE finally got benefits after that long fight. The legacy continues. Men like Major General Antonio Taguba, West Point graduate, dad a Philippine scout, and this young Marine who served in my unit, Corporal Neil Nieto, in the reserve, who received a Navy Achievement Medal for valor for rescuing his team member under fire in Iraq, who had been wounded. And these are the 4 Filipino Americans that are recipients of the Medal of Honor. We just do not have a picture of Private Jose B. Nisperos. He's one we don't have a photograph of. And that is it, unless you have questions.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That was so great. There we go. Now it's time for some questions. So I'll bring the microphone to you, and we'll take a few. Okay.
Early on in the presentation, you mentioned the importance of the Philippines essentially being the high police in the South Pacific as far as trade and military action, that sort of thing. But now, of course, we know that China is kind of running roughshod over all that.
Yeah, the Philippines, I'll tell you right now, if the Philippines was 5,000 miles further east, nobody would care about them. We wouldn't care about them. But again, whoever controls the Philippines controlled the South China Sea, so it's understandable why the People's Republic of China is claiming large portions right to the edge of Philippine national waters of the South China Sea as theirs.
And harassing them, I guess.
Yes, and once again, the Philippines is caught between these empires. First the Spanish and the Americans, and the Japanese and the Americans. Now the Chinese and the Americans. Would they like to be the Switzerland of the Pacific? Yes, but how do they defend themselves? Switzerland is surrounded by the Alps. You're not just going to waltz into the Switzerland. You got to climb those mountains. The Philippines doesn't have any natural barriers to keep the Chinese at bay. So that's the dilemma for the Philippines.
I'll take one over here.
I just have a comment. My husband was in the Philippines, or he's Filipino, he's in the Coast Guard. But he was telling me about World War II, when the Japanese were there in the Philippines. He said him and his mother would go out and get food because they had to keep their dad hidden so the Japanese wouldn't kill him.
Yes, there was a great fear of the Japanese. Like I said, the Japanese did not endear themselves to the Filipino people. The way they treated the Filipinos, forcing them to learn Japanese. The other thing is they really screwed up the entire Filipino agricultural system during World War II. They tried to convert them from rice to cotton. And so you had a lot of hunger and famine. But probably the biggest travesty of the war that is still controversial was when American forces were approaching the city of Manila in January 1945. MacArthur was expecting the Japanese to abandon the city the way he had done in December 1941. The Japanese army did, but the Japanese Navy didn't. and it was a house-to-house fight. 500,000 Filipinos died during the Battle of Manila. It was the third most destroyed city in World War II. Well, actually, fourth most destroyed city during World War II, behind Stalingrad, Warsaw, and Berlin. Then it was Manila.
Thank you, Jeff, for your colorful talk, as always, and thank you for plugging, the Manugo family. Anyway, I will ask, the U.S. Army trained and asked for Filipino nurses to serve in the Volunteer Auxiliary and Nurse Corps. Can you talk a little bit about when that happened and how many nurses, I guess they were women at that time, Filipinas, came to the U.S. in that pathway?
That
Thanks.
pathway mainly comes out of 1965 with another Immigration Act, and that one opened up. It opened up the U.S. if you had a talent. Now understand, that act was not so much designed for agricultural workers. It was designed for professionals. And for Filipino doctors and nurses, the golden ticket was the U.S. You could get paid more to get to the U.S., and they had a profession. We needed nurses, we needed doctors, and they were able to come over in the United States and train. So they were able to quickly get a green card, come to the U.S., and become citizens eventually. The problem was what it did to the Philippines. It created what's known as a brain drain to the Philippines. And that, it had a plus side for the U.S., a downside for the Philippines. As a matter of fact, there is a thing called the Philippine diaspora. And if you look, I think it's 25% of the current Philippine gross domestic product is remittance payments sent back to the Philippines by Filipinos living in countries around the world. And so that's one of the challenges. And so, yes, the nurse, it did great, but there was a negative side to the Philippines. They lost a lot of talent in medical personnel.
So I will just add that an exciting event that's happening across our region is the documentary Nursing.
Here's the microphone.
Saturday, November 16th, there are 3 community screenings for folks to watch in Newport News. There's a screening in the afternoon, and then there's also one in Regent, brought to you by the SIVA, the Southeastern Virginia Filipino American Peninsula Lions. And then the Southside Lions, Filipino American Lions, will be screening and doing a community panel at the MacArthur Memorial Visitor Theater in downtown Norfolk. So I hope you all look out for that information. That's going to be pushed out in the community. It's just right around the corner. And so that wasn't really a plant. I was interested in nurses and Filipino Americans,
Yeah,
but I do want you all to know about that because we are very excited to bring this award-winning documentary to our communities in Hampton Roads. Thanks.
And Vicki's got me thinking. We have here in Southeast Virginia 3 what I call centers of learning about Philippine American history. The first and oldest is the MacArthur Memorial in downtown Norfolk. And of course, the riddle of the MacArthur Memorial is, why is Mr. Army buried in Squid City? Okay? And that's because his mother was from Norfolk. And he wanted the equivalent of a presidential library. They gave it to him. But there are over 5,000 volumes in the library alone on Philippine and Philippine American history, both in variety of languages in Tagalog. For example, I found a book that was published in 1938 called Philippine Folk Tales, based on province. And of course, for those of you who know about, what's that show about the detective who could see demons? That was on about 5-6 years ago. I'm doing a brain dump. They even had a Filipino demon known as an aswan. And boy, that was a scary demon. Boy, the Filipinos really, that was a demon that sucked babies out. Oh, it was terrible. It was very scary. I didn't know about that. But the other is the Philippine Cultural Center on Baxter Road, which is where the monument dedicated to Filipinos who served in the U.S. Navy is located. And also the San Lorenzo Spiritual Center, which is located on Indian River Road. So the thing we wanted to come up here for is because so few of, we feel for our Filipino cousins living on the peninsula. We have to come up here more often and work with you all because we want you to be part. You're part of the Hampton Roads area and the Hampton Roads story.
Okay, one more question.
Hi, well, my whole family immigrated here because my grandpa fought in the Navy. He was a cook, and ironically, my grandma was a nurse. But my family is big on culture, and what's fascinating is the fact that, yes, there's discrimination in the military, but was also my mom could not learn the language because they were also terrified of discrimination back in the 1960s, with just in general with everything going on.
Yeah, that's going to be the challenge of every immigrant to the U.S. Our lingua franca is English, and that's why in the public school systems we have, Vicki, what do we call that to teach students who?
Yeah. Oh.
English language learners now trying to address that issue. That didn't exist in the 60s. That didn't exist in the 60s. My mother grew up speaking Spanish in Brooklyn, New York, and the attitude was, she'll learn English out on the street. Well, it's not the best way to learn English, but it worked, so. Then.
Great. Well, we want to thank Jeff once again. Thank you so
You're
much for
welcome.
this great afternoon. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.